Could you bear to see your child cry from hunger while you don't even have a penny in your pocket? David held 3-year-old Noah in his arms on a crowded bus, trying to hide the tears that kept falling, evicted, broke, and hopeless, until a stranger handed him a note with just 3 words that changed everything. But before you find out what was written, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share this story, because what you're about to see will touch your heart forever. The city bus lurched through another pothole, and David's arms tightened instinctively around his 3-year-old son, Noah. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered like dying stars, casting harsh shadows across the faces of strangers who pretended not to notice his quiet sobs. His weathered hands, once steady enough to fix any engine, now trembled as he held the most precious thing he had left in this world. Noah's small fingers clutched at his father's worn jacket, the fabric thin from too many washes and not enough hope. "Daddy," the little boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the rumble of the engine and the city's relentless heartbeat outside. David pressed his lips to his son's forehead, tasting salt from his own tears, and whispered back, "It's gonna be okay, buddy. Daddy's got you." But David knew he was lying. The eviction notice crumpled in his back pocket felt like a death sentence, and the $3.47 in his wallet wouldn't even buy them dinner tonight. His reflection in the grimy window showed a man who'd aged a decade in the past 2 years. Hollow cheeks, eyes that had forgotten how to smile, and shoulders that carried the weight of a world that had stopped making sense. Across the narrow aisle, an elegant woman in her 50s watched him with eyes that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed facade. Her perfectly pressed blazer and pearl earrings made her stand out like a diamond in a coal mine among the tired commuters. She didn't look away when their eyes met, didn't offer the polite avoidance that had become so familiar to David since his life had fallen apart. The bus wheezed to a stop at 5th and Main, and the woman stood gracefully, her movements deliberate and calm. David expected her to disappear into the night like everyone else who passed through his broken life. But instead, she paused beside his seat. Without a word, she placed a small, folded piece of paper in his free hand, her fingers warm against his cold skin, for just a moment. "Some battles aren't meant to be fought alone," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of confidence that comes from someone who's weathered her own storms. Before David could respond, before he could even process what had just happened, she was gone, swallowed by the crowd streaming off the bus into the neon-lit darkness of the city. With shaking fingers, David unfolded the paper. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, and the 3 words written there hit him like a punch to the gut. "You haven't failed." Below that, a business card was taped neatly. Elizabeth Moore, Human Resources Director, accompanied by a phone number that looked like it might be his last lifeline. Noah shifted in his arms, and David looked down at his son's sleepy face, so innocent and trusting despite everything they'd been through. The little boy's faith in his father remained unshaken, even when David's faith in himself had crumbled to dust. Those 3 words on the paper seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, challenging everything David believed about himself in this moment. As the bus continued its journey through the city's arteries, David clutched the note like a drowning man grabs a rope. He didn't know who Elizabeth Moore was, didn't understand why a stranger would care about his pain. But for the first time in months, something that felt dangerously like hope began to flicker in the darkness of his chest. What could 3 simple words from a stranger possibly mean to a man who'd lost everything that mattered? 2 years ago, David Martinez had been a different man entirely. He'd wake up every morning to the smell of Anna's coffee brewing in their little kitchen, the sound of her humming off key while she got ready for her job at the community center. Noah would toddle between them, babbling in that mysterious language only toddlers speak, and David would head off to Martinez Auto Repair, the shop he'd built from nothing with his own 2 hands. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and that had been enough. The cancer took Anna so fast it felt like a cruel magic trick. Now you see her, now you don't. One day she was complaining about being tired. The next, she was in a hospital bed with doctors using words like aggressive and terminal, and I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do. David spent their savings on treatments that didn't work, sold the auto shop to pay for experimental therapies that gave them hope for exactly 3 weeks, and watched the woman he'd loved since high school slip away like sand through his fingers. Now, at 32, David felt ancient. The boarding house on Elm Street wasn't just a roof over their heads, it was a daily reminder of how far they'd fallen. The room smelled like decades of other people's desperation, and the walls were so thin he could hear Mrs. Patterson next door crying herself to sleep every night. Noah had gotten used to sleeping curled up against his father's chest on the narrow single bed, and David had gotten used to lying awake, counting the hours until sunrise, wondering how much longer he could keep this charade going. Every morning was the same impossible math problem. Rent was due in 3 days, but if he paid it, they wouldn't eat for a week. Noah needed new shoes because his toes were poking through the old ones. But new shoes meant no money for the laundromat, and David was already embarrassed by how they looked. "Daddy, I'm hungry," had become the soundtrack of his failures, and each time Noah said it, David felt another piece of his soul chip away like old paint. The temp agency called him reliable and paid him just enough to keep them hovering above complete disaster. Loading trucks, cleaning office buildings, whatever soul-crushing work they had available, David took it all without complaint. His hands, once skilled enough to diagnose any engine problem by sound alone, now ached from moving boxes and scrubbing floors. But even that wasn't enough, and the eviction notice had made it official. He was failing at the only job that truly mattered. Elizabeth Moore's business card felt heavier than it should in his pocket, like it was made of lead instead of paper. He'd pulled it out a dozen times since getting off the bus, running his thumb over the embossed letters, trying to imagine what kind of person leaves mysterious notes for strangers. The phone number stared back at him like a dare, and every time he considered calling, Anna's voice echoed in his memory. "Pride's just fear wearing a fancy suit, David. Don't let it keep you from asking for help." But this wasn't just about pride anymore. It was about protecting Noah from the ugly truth that his father had become exactly the kind of man Anna had always believed he'd never be. The little boy still looked at David like he hung the moon, still trusted him to fix everything with the same confidence he'd once had in David's ability to fix carburetors and transmission problems. Those 3 words on the paper, "You haven't failed," felt like a beautiful lie that David wanted desperately to believe. Could a stranger's words really offer salvation to a man who'd already lost everything that defined him? David Martinez had always been the kind of man who spoke with his hands more than his mouth. Even as a kid, he'd take apart old radios and toasters just to see how they worked, his mother finding him surrounded by tiny screws and circuits like some mechanical archaeologist. His father, a construction worker with permanently stained fingers, used to say, "That boy's got magic in his hands, Maria. He can fix anything except his own stubborn heart." It was a joke that turned prophetic. David could resurrect dead engines and breathe life into broken transmissions, but he'd never learned how to repair the parts of himself that really mattered. The watch on his wrist hadn't worked in 18 months. Its cracked face frozen at 3:47, the exact time Anna had flatlined in room 237 of St. Mary's Hospital. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away or get it fixed, wearing it like a hair shirt, a constant reminder of the moment his world stopped spinning. Sometimes Noah would grab his father's wrist and shake it, trying to make the second hand move again, and David would have to swallow the sob that always threatened to escape when his son tried to fix things the way his daddy used to. His reflection in the boarding house mirror told the story of a man who'd forgotten how to take care of himself. The beard he'd grown wasn't a fashion choice. It was easier than looking at his own face while shaving. His flannel shirts, once crisp and clean, now hung loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. But his eyes were the real giveaway. They'd gone from Anna's favorite shade of warm chocolate to something flat and lifeless, like windows in an abandoned house. "Daddy, why do you whisper all the time now?" Noah had asked him last week, and David realized he'd been unconsciously lowering his voice ever since the funeral, as if speaking too loudly might wake Anna up and force her to see what he'd become. He talked to his son in hushed tones about everything: bedtime stories, grocery lists, apologies for meals that were just crackers, and whatever he could find in the boarding house's communal kitchen. It was like he was trying to protect the whole world from his presence. The toolbox under their bed was David's most precious possession, after Noah, a red Craftsman set that Anna had bought him for their first Christmas as a married couple. Most of the tools had been sold months ago to pay for Noah's medicine when he'd had pneumonia, but David kept the empty box anyway. Sometimes he'd open it just to smell the lingering scent of motor oil and metal shavings, closing his eyes and pretending he was back in his shop, back when his biggest worry was whether the coffee was strong enough to get him through the day. Anna used to say he had a gift for seeing potential where others saw junk: rusted cars that could purr like kittens again, broken appliances that just needed patience and the right touch. "You don't just fix things, David," she told him once while watching him work on their neighbor's lawnmower. "You believe in them. You see what they could be instead of what they are." Now, staring at Elizabeth Moore's business card for the 100th time, he wondered if he'd lost that gift along with everything else, or if maybe, just maybe, it was time to turn that faith on himself. The boarding house walls seemed to close in a little more each day, but David had developed rituals to keep the claustrophobia at bay. Every morning, he'd make Noah's bed with military precision, fold their few clothes into neat stacks, and clean their shared sink until it sparkled. These small acts of control were all that stood between him and the complete surrender that whispered his name in the dark hours before dawn. When Noah would wake up and say, "Good morning, Daddy," in that sleepy voice that sounded so much like Anna's, David would remember why he had to keep fighting, why giving up wasn't an option as long as those little eyes still looked at him like he was a hero. How long can a man survive on the fumes of who he used to be before he forgets the way back to himself? At 3 in the morning, Noah's fever spiked to 102, and David found himself running through empty streets in his bare feet, his sun burning like a coal against his chest. The emergency room at County General was a fluorescent purgatory of waiting and worry, filled with the kind of people who couldn't afford to get sick but had no choice in the matter. "That'll be $87 for the consultation," the receptionist said, without looking up, and David felt his last thread of financial security snap like a guitar string under too much tension. The next morning, with Noah finally sleeping peacefully and David's wallet completely empty, he dragged himself to Loadmaster Logistics for another day of moving other people's lives from point A to point B. His supervisor, Jerry Kowalski, was the kind of man who measured his own worth by how small he could make everyone else feel. "Martinez, you look like hell warmed over," Jerry barked, his coffee breath hitting David's face like a slap. "We're not running a charity here. You gonna work or you gonna stand there looking pathetic?" The warehouse floor stretched out like a concrete ocean filled with boxes that needed to be moved, sorted, and shipped to destinations David would never see. His back ached from sleeping on the boarding house's medieval mattress. His hands were still shaking from Noah's fever scare, and every breath felt like he was inhaling dust and defeat. "Hey, Martinez," called out Tommy Rodriguez, one of the few guys who didn't treat him like a ghost. "You okay, man? You look like you seen a ghost." David just nodded and picked up another box, because talking would mean admitting how close to breaking he really was. By noon, Jerry had found 3 different reasons to humiliate David in front of the other workers. First, it was moving too slow. Then it was stacking boxes wrong. Finally, it was the unforgivable sin of taking an extra 2 minutes on his break to call the boarding house and check on Noah. "You think this is some kind of country club, Martinez?" Jerry's voice carried across the warehouse like an air raid siren. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable at one of those fancy offices downtown." "Oh, wait. They don't hire losers there either." The other workers looked away when Jerry went on his tirades, their eyes finding sudden interest in their clipboards and shipping labels. David understood. They all had their own problems, their own bills to pay, their own reasons for swallowing their pride 8 hours a day. But understanding didn't make the humiliation any easier to bear, especially when he caught his reflection in the warehouse windows and saw his father's broken expression staring back at him. This wasn't who he'd planned to become when he'd kissed Anna goodbye that last morning, promising to be strong for both of them. That evening, back at the boarding house, David counted his remaining money 3 times, hoping the math would somehow change. $13.26. Not enough for Noah's asthma inhaler, and definitely not enough for next week's rent. Mrs. Patterson knocked on their door around 8, her face creased with the kind of worry that only other parents understand. "David, honey, is Noah okay? I heard him coughing through the walls last night." She pressed a $20 bill into his hand before he could protest. "Don't you dare say no. That boy needs his medicine, and pride don't cure sick babies." As Noah slept fitfully beside him, David pulled out Elizabeth Moore's business card one more time, the paper now soft from handling. The boarding house was quiet except for the sound of someone's television bleeding through the thin walls and the distant hum of traffic that never really stopped in this part of the city. 3 words, "You haven't failed," seemed to mock him from the elegant cardstock. Maybe Elizabeth Moore had never had to choose between her child's medicine and next month's rent. Maybe she'd never felt the crushing weight of being completely powerless to protect the person who mattered most. But then again, maybe she had, and that's exactly why she'd left the note in the first place. When you're drowning in quicksand, does it matter if the hand reaching down belongs to a stranger or a saint? The phone felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in David's trembling hand. He'd been staring at Elizabeth Moore's business card for 20 minutes, practicing what he'd say, but every rehearsed line sounded pathetic in his head. "Hi, you don't know me, but you gave me a note on a bus." God, how desperate did that sound. Noah was at the boarding house's makeshift daycare, run by Mrs. Chen in the basement, giving David the privacy he needed to either take this leap of faith or confirm once and for all that he really was the failure Jerry Kowalski said he was. Tech Vantage Solutions, Elizabeth Moore's office. "This is Patricia speaking." The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, the kind of efficiency that belonged in a world where people wore actual suits to work instead of paint-stained flannel shirts. David's throat went dry, and for a moment he couldn't remember how to form words. "Hello, is anyone there?" Patricia asked, and David realized he was about to hang up like a teenager making prank calls. Yes, sorry. I need to speak with Elizabeth Moore. She gave me her card." "One moment, please." The hold music was some kind of smooth jazz that probably cost more to license than David made in a month. He caught his reflection in the payphone's grimy metal surface and saw a man who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts. Anna's old sweater that hung too loose, jeans with a patch over the knee, shoes that had given up pretending to be waterproof months ago. What was he thinking? People like Elizabeth Moore didn't really help people like him. That whole thing on the bus was probably just some random act of pity that she'd already forgotten. "David, this is Elizabeth." Her voice was exactly as he remembered, warm but authoritative, like someone who'd learned how to be kind without being weak. "I was hoping you'd call. How are you and your little boy doing?" The question hit him like a sucker punch because nobody had asked him that in months. Everyone assumed he was fine, or they simply didn't want to know the answer. We're managing," he lied, then immediately hated himself for it. If he was going to do this, he might as well be honest. "Actually, no, we're not managing at all." "I know," Elizabeth said simply, and somehow those 2 words carried more comfort than all the platitudes he'd heard since Anna died. "Why don't you come in tomorrow morning? Say, 10 o'clock? We can talk properly then." David's heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. I don't have anything to wear to an office. I mean, I have clothes, but they're not—" He was rambling, panic making his words tumble over each other like dominoes. "David," Elizabeth interrupted gently, "just come as you are. I'm not interviewing your wardrobe." The next morning, David stood outside the gleaming glass tower that housed TechVantage Solutions, feeling like an alien who'd crash-landed on the wrong planet. Men and women in expensive suits flowed around him like water around a stone, their confident strides and purposeful expressions a sharp contrast to his hesitant shuffle. He'd done his best. Borrowed a tie from Mr. Patterson next door, polished his shoes until they almost looked respectable, and even managed to get Noah to the community center's daycare program with a promise to pick him up by noon. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt like ascending to heaven, each ding of the floors marking another step away from the world he knew and towards something that felt impossibly out of reach. When the doors opened, David stepped into a reception area that looked like it belonged in a magazine. All clean lines, modern art, and the kind of silence that money buys. The receptionist, a young woman with a smile as polished as the marble floors, looked at him with the same expression people usually reserved for stray dogs. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting that helping him was the last thing she wanted to do. Was this leap of faith just another way to fall? Or could a man really climb out of rock bottom on the strength of 3 words from a stranger? Elizabeth Moore appeared in the reception area like an angel in a business suit, her presence immediately changing the temperature of the room. She was shorter than David remembered, maybe 5'4" in her sensible heels, but she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that made people straighten their spines without thinking about it. "David," she said, extending her hand with a smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you for coming. I know this took courage." The receptionist's expression shifted from disdain to curiosity as she watched her boss treat this scruffy stranger like he actually mattered. Her office was nothing like David had expected. Instead of the cold corporate shrine he'd imagined, it felt warm and lived in. Family photos sat next to industry awards, and a coffee-stained mug that read "World's Okayest Boss" held a collection of colorful pens. "Sit wherever you're comfortable," Elizabeth said, gesturing to a couch that looked like it had actually been sat in before. "Can I get you some coffee? Fair warning, I make it strong enough to wake the dead." David found himself almost smiling for the first time in weeks. "That sounds perfect, Mom. I haven't slept much lately." "Tell me about Noah," Elizabeth said, as she poured coffee from a machine that probably cost more than David's monthly rent. It wasn't the question he'd expected, and for a moment he was thrown off balance. He's 3, smart as a whip, just like his mum was. He loves trucks and dinosaurs and—" David's voice caught. "He asks why we don't live in our old house anymore, and I don't know what to tell him that won't break his heart." Elizabeth nodded slowly, like she understood the weight of protecting a child from harsh realities. "Being a parent is the hardest job in the world, and you're doing it alone. That takes strength most people don't have." "I saw something in you on that bus," Elizabeth continued, settling into the chair across from him. "You weren't just holding your son, you were shielding him. Even in your darkest moment, your first instinct was to protect him from seeing your pain. That tells me more about your character than any resume ever could." David stared into his coffee cup, not trusting himself to speak. Nobody had talked to him like this since Anna died, like he was still a person worth knowing, instead of just another casualty of life's unfairness. The interview that followed felt more like a conversation between old friends than a formal job discussion. Elizabeth asked about his experience at the auto shop, his problem-solving skills, his ability to work under pressure. "We have an opening in our facilities management department," she explained. "It's not glamorous. You'd be maintaining our building systems, troubleshooting equipment, basically keeping this place running smoothly. But it's steady work, good benefits, and there's room to grow if you're interested in learning." David's hands started shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fear. "Why are you doing this?" David asked, the question that had been burning in his chest since that night on the bus. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "Because someone did it for me once," she said finally. 20 years ago, I was a single mother working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. A stranger saw me crying in a grocery store parking lot because I couldn't afford both diapers and dinner, and she changed my life with one simple act of kindness. Sometimes we're the ones who need saving, and sometimes we're the ones who get to do the saving. As David prepared to leave, Elizabeth walked him to the elevator, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "David, I want you to understand something. This isn't charity. I wouldn't offer you this position if I didn't believe you could do the job. Your references from the temp agency speak volumes about your reliability, and your experience speaks for itself. You're not a project to be fixed. You're a person with value, and it's time you started believing that again." The elevator doors opened, and David stepped inside, clutching the paperwork she'd given him like a life preserver. For the first time in 2 years, the future didn't look like a wall he was about to hit. Could it really be this simple, one conversation changing everything, or was David setting himself up for the kind of fall that breaks a man completely? 3 days before David was supposed to start at Tech Vantage, Mrs. Chen knocked on his door with the kind of expression that makes your stomach drop to your shoes. "David, honey, I got some bad news," she said, wringing her hands like she was trying to squeeze water from stone. "The city's condemning this whole building. We got 1 week to get out before they bring in the wrecking balls." Behind her, other residents were already dragging suitcases and garbage bags full of their lives down the hallway, their faces wearing the same shell-shocked look David recognized from his own mirror. The demolition notice taped to the front door might as well have been his death certificate. In 7 days, he and Noah would be homeless. Actually, homeless. Not just poor people with a roof homeless. David's new job would start him at $2,400 a month, which sounded like a fortune compared to what he'd been making, but first month's rent plus security deposit plus utilities would eat up most of his first paycheck. Every rental he'd called wanted credit checks and references and deposits he simply didn't have. "Daddy, why are you crying?" Noah asked, tugging at his father's sleeve, and David realized tears were streaming down his face like a broken faucet. At Tech Vantage the next morning, David felt like an imposter wearing borrowed confidence. His supervisor, Marcus Webb, was nothing like Jerry Kowalski. He spoke quietly, explained tasks clearly, and actually seemed to care whether David understood what he was doing. "You'll get the hang of it," Marcus said, as they walked through the building's mechanical rooms. "Elizabeth told me you used to run your own auto shop. This is just engines on a bigger scale." But David's mind kept drifting to cardboard boxes and park benches, and the growing certainty that he was about to lose everything all over again. By Wednesday, the stress was eating David alive from the inside out. He made 3 mistakes on his second day. Nothing major, just the kind of small errors that happen when your brain is screaming about homelessness while you're trying to focus on HVAC systems. Marcus pulled him aside after lunch, his expression unreadable. "David, I need to ask, is everything okay at home? You seem distracted." For a moment, David considered telling him everything, but the words stuck in his throat like broken glass. How do you explain that you're about to drag your 3-year-old son into the streets without sounding like exactly the kind of unstable employee they'd be crazy to keep? That evening, David sat on the floor of their soon-to-be-demolished room, surrounded by the few possessions they couldn't afford to lose. Noah had fallen asleep clutching his favorite toy truck, the one Anna had bought him for his 2nd birthday, and David watched his son's peaceful face while his own world crumbled around them. He'd called every shelter in the city, but they were all full, and the waiting list stretched longer than his remaining hope. Mrs. Patterson had offered to let them sleep on her couch, but she was being evicted too, and her sister's trailer only had room for 1 extra person. The business card Elizabeth had given him sat on the windowsill, and David stared at it through eyes blurred with exhaustion and despair. How could he face her on Monday, knowing he'd failed again before he'd even really started? How could he explain that the man she'd believed in was just another casualty of a system that crushed people like him for sport? "You haven't failed," the note had said, but sitting in a room that would be rubble in 4 days, with a son who trusted him to keep them safe, David felt like failure was the only thing he'd ever been good at. At 2 a.m., with Noah coughing softly in his sleep and the sound of other families packing their lives into boxes echoing through the thin walls, David pulled out Elizabeth's note one last time. The paper was soft now, worn from being handled like a rosary, and the 3 words seemed to mock him in the darkness. Maybe some people were meant to be saved, and others were just meant to serve as warnings about what happens when you reach too high. Maybe tomorrow he'd have to make the call that would end this beautiful dream before it could turn into another nightmare. Maybe "you haven't failed" was just something kind people said to make themselves feel better about walking away. When the weight of the world finally breaks your back, do you get back up, or do you teach your son that some dreams are too dangerous to chase? Friday morning arrived like a slap in the face, and David was loading their few belongings into garbage bags when Lucas Rodriguez appeared in their doorway like some kind of guardian angel in work boots. Lucas was the kind of guy who fixed things just because they were broken, building maintenance at Tech Vantage for 7 years, divorced father of 2, and apparently the owner of eyes that could see straight through David's carefully constructed facade. "Man, what the hell is going on here?" Lucas asked, taking in the scene of controlled desperation. "Marcus told me you've been looking like death warmed over, and now I see why." "It's not your problem, Lucas," David said, shoving Noah's clothes into a bag with more force than necessary. But Lucas wasn't having it. He sat down on the edge of the stripped mattress like he had all day, his calloused hands folded in his lap. "Look, hermano, I've been where you are. 3 years ago, my ex-wife cleaned out our bank account and disappeared with my kids for 6 months. I was living in my truck, showering at the gym, eating gas station sandwiches for dinner. Pride's expensive, and right now you can't afford it." The simple truth of it hit David like a physical blow, and he had to sit down before his knees gave out. "I got a 2-bedroom apartment about 20 minutes from work," Lucas continued, his voice gentle but firm. "My kids only visit every other weekend, so there's plenty of space. You and Noah can stay as long as you need to get back on your feet. No rent until you're stable, and then we'll figure out something fair." David opened his mouth to refuse, the automatic response of a man who'd been taught that accepting help was admitting defeat. But Lucas held up his hand. "Before you say no, think about that little boy. He needs stability more than you need your pride." That evening, David found himself in Lucas's clean, modest apartment, watching Noah explore his new temporary home with the kind of wonder only 3-year-olds possess. "Look, Daddy, a real bathtub," Noah called out, his voice echoing from the bathroom, and David felt something crack open in his chest. It was just a bathtub, nothing fancy, but to Noah it represented luxury beyond imagination. Lucas appeared with 2 beers and a pizza box, settling onto the couch beside David. "You know what saved my life when everything went to hell?" he asked. "Routine, structure, showing up anyway, even when showing up felt impossible." At work, David threw himself into learning everything he could absorb. The building systems became his new obsession: heating, cooling, electrical, plumbing, security. Every manual, every schematic, every troubleshooting guide became required reading during his lunch breaks and after Noah went to sleep. Marcus noticed the change immediately. "Someone's been doing their homework," he said, watching David diagnose a temperamental boiler that had been acting up for weeks. "You figured out in 2 days what it took our last guy 6 months to understand." The praise felt foreign but good, like sunlight on skin that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Elizabeth stopped by the maintenance office one afternoon, ostensibly to check on a repair request, but David caught her watching him work with something that looked like quiet satisfaction. "How are you settling in?" she asked, and for the first time since Anna's death, David could answer honestly without wanting to disappear into the floor. "Better than I expected, Mom. Lucas has been, well, he's been a lifesaver." Elizabeth smiled, the kind of real smile that crinkles the corners of your eyes. "Lucas is good people. So are you, David. I'm glad you're finally starting to see that." That night, David sat at Lucas's kitchen table with Noah coloring beside him and a stack of technical manuals spread out like a buffet of possibility. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of his son's crayons scratching against paper and the distant hum of traffic that somehow felt peaceful instead of threatening. For the first time in 2 years, David allowed himself to imagine a future that extended beyond just surviving until tomorrow. Maybe Elizabeth had been right, maybe he really hadn't failed, maybe he'd just been temporarily defeated, and there was a difference between the two that he was finally learning to understand. When a man stops running from his problems and starts building solutions instead, does the world really change, or does he just finally see it clearly? 3 weeks into his new routine, David was troubleshooting a malfunctioning elevator when Elizabeth appeared beside him like a ghost from his past. "David, when you have a moment, could you come to my office? There's something I need to show you." Her tone was different, softer, almost hesitant, like someone about to reveal a secret they'd been carrying too long. The elevator could wait. Something in Elizabeth's eyes told him this couldn't. He followed her through the maze of corporate corridors, his work boots echoing against the polished floors like a countdown to something he couldn't name. Elizabeth's office felt different today, charged with an energy that made the air itself seem heavier. She moved to a filing cabinet behind her desk and withdrew a manila folder, her movements careful and deliberate. "Before I show you this, I need you to know that what happened on the bus wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence." She opened the folder and pulled out a photograph, a picture of Anna at some kind of community event, her smile radiant as she handed out food to families in need. David's breath caught in his throat like a fishhook. "Where did you get this?" "Ana Martinez was one of the most remarkable people I've ever known," Elizabeth said, settling into the chair across from him. "We worked together on the Haven Project, a program that provided job training and childcare for single mothers. Anna coordinated our volunteer efforts, and I helped place graduates in positions throughout the city. She talked about you constantly, David. About your skills, your heart, your determination to build something meaningful together." The words hit David like physical blows, each one cracking open emotions he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed. Elizabeth pulled out more photos. Anna at board meetings, Anna organizing clothing drives, Anna laughing with children in what looked like a daycare setting. She was so proud of your auto shop, of how you'd built it from nothing. But more than that, she was proud of the man you were becoming as a father. She'd show pictures of Noah to anyone who'd look, talking about how gentle you were with him, how you'd sing him to sleep every night. David's hands were shaking now, and he had to set down the photographs before he dropped them. This felt like archaeology of the heart, like Elizabeth was excavating pieces of his life he'd thought were lost forever. "The night before she went into the hospital for the last time, Anna called me," Elizabeth continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was terrified, not of dying, but of leaving you alone to carry everything. She made me promise that if something happened to her, I'd watch over you somehow. She said, 'David's going to blame himself for not being able to save me, and he'll forget that he's stronger than he knows.'" The room went silent, except for the sound of David's ragged breathing and the distant hum of the building's life support systems. Elizabeth reached into the folder one last time and pulled out a handwritten note. The paper yellowed at the edges, like it had been folded and unfolded countless times. "She wrote this for you, David. I was supposed to give it to you at the funeral, but you disappeared so completely afterward that I couldn't find you. When I saw you on that bus, holding Noah and looking so lost, I knew it was time." She placed the note in his trembling hands, and David recognized Anna's careful script immediately. "My dearest David, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. But you're still here, and that means everything. You haven't failed me, you haven't failed Noah, you haven't failed yourself. Keep trying, keep building, keep believing. I'll be watching." The note was signed with Anna's name and dated 3 days before she died, but at the bottom, in different ink, someone had added 3 words: "You haven't failed." David looked up at Elizabeth through eyes blurred with tears, understanding flooding through him like sunrise after the longest night. "The note on the bus," he whispered. It wasn't random inspiration. It was her. Elizabeth nodded, tears running down her own cheeks. It was always her, David. I was just the messenger she couldn't be. How do you rebuild a life when you discover that the woman you lost never really left, and the stranger who saved you was never really a stranger at all? 2 days after Elizabeth's revelation, David was called into Marcus's office for what he assumed was a routine check-in, but the tension in the room felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Sitting across from Marcus was Richard Sterling, the facilities director, a man who wore his authority like armor and had the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "David, we need to discuss a serious issue," Marcus said, his usual warmth replaced by professional distance. "There's been a significant problem with the HVAC system in the East Wing, and your work orders show you were the last person to service that area." The accusation hit David like a sucker punch to the gut. Sterling leaned forward, his fingers steepled like he was conducting an interrogation. "The damage is extensive, nearly $50,000 in repairs, not to mention the disruption to our operations. We have documentation showing you signed off on maintenance that clearly wasn't performed correctly." David's mind raced, remembering every detail of that job. He'd spent extra time on that system because it had been making unusual noises, and he'd followed the manual to the letter. "Sir, I triple-checked that work. Something's not right here. Are you suggesting our documentation is wrong?" Sterling's voice carried the kind of ice that could freeze hell over. He slid a folder across the table, filled with work orders and inspection reports that painted David as either incompetent or negligent. "Perhaps the stress of your personal situation has affected your performance more than you realize. We understand you've been dealing with housing issues, family problems. Maybe this job is simply beyond your current capabilities." The words were designed to wound, and they found their mark with surgical precision. But something inside David had changed during these past weeks. The broken man who would have accepted blame for anything was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned his own worth. "I want to see the actual system," David said, standing up with a confidence that surprised even him. "If I made a mistake, I'll own it. But I know my work and I know I did that job right. Something doesn't add up here." Sterling's eyes flashed with annoyance, like he'd expected David to crumble under pressure the way Jerry Kowalski's victims always had. The walk to the East Wing felt like a death march, with Sterling and Marcus flanking David like prison guards. But when they reached the mechanical room, David's trained eye immediately spotted something that made his blood run cold. The system had been sabotaged. Valves closed that should have been open, connections loosened just enough to cause failure, settings changed from the specifications he'd carefully recorded. "This wasn't mechanical failure," David said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Someone did this deliberately." Sterling's mask slipped for just a moment, and David caught the flash of panic in his eyes before the man recovered his composure. "That's a serious accusation, Martinez. You're suggesting sabotage to cover up your own incompetence?" But David was already pulling out his phone, photographing the evidence, documenting each deliberate act of vandalism. Marcus watched in growing understanding, his expression shifting from suspicion to something that looked like respect. "David's right," Marcus said quietly. "This was done on purpose." The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. Security footage revealed Sterling entering the mechanical room after hours, and a deeper investigation uncovered months of similar sabotage designed to make the maintenance staff look incompetent. Sterling had been skimming money from repair budgets and needed scapegoats to cover his tracks. As security escorted Sterling from the building, he turned to David with pure hatred in his eyes. "You think you've won something here, Martinez. You're still just another loser who got lucky." But David looked him straight in the eye and smiled, really smiled, for the first time in years. "Maybe I am lucky," he said, "but I'm not a loser anymore. Indeed, when a man stops running from his past and starts fighting for his future, does he become someone new, or does he finally become who he was always meant to be?" 6 months later, David stood in the doorway of his own apartment, Not Lucas's guest room, not a boarding house, but a real home, with Noah's drawings taped to the refrigerator and morning sunlight streaming through windows that belonged to them. The promotion to senior facilities technician had come with a salary that allowed him to breathe again, to make choices based on what was best for Noah instead of what they could barely afford. "Daddy, look!" Noah called from his bedroom, proudly displaying a tower of blocks that reached almost to his waist. "I built it all by myself." The pride in his son's voice was like music David had forgotten he loved. The apartment wasn't fancy, 2 bedrooms in a complex that had seen better decades, but it felt like a palace compared to where they'd been. David had spent weekends painting Noah's room a cheerful yellow, assembling furniture from discount stores, and slowly collecting the small comforts that transform a space into a sanctuary. The kitchen table where they ate breakfast every morning had been Anna's, rescued from storage when David finally felt strong enough to reclaim pieces of their past without drowning in grief. Every Tuesday evening, David drove to the Haven Project Community Center, the same place where Anna had once worked her quiet magic on broken families. He'd started teaching basic automotive repair to anyone who wanted to learn. Teenagers aging out of foster care, single mothers trying to stretch their budgets, men like himself who'd lost their way and needed to remember what their hands could build instead of just what they'd lost. "The engine's just like a heart," he'd tell his students, echoing something Anna used to say. "Sometimes it stops, but that doesn't mean it can't beat again." Elizabeth had become more than a boss. She was the kind of friend Anna would have wanted David to have, someone who understood that healing happens in layers, like paint covering old scars. They'd have coffee every few weeks, and she'd update him on the Haven Project's expansion, the new job training programs, the families they were helping find their footing. "Anna would be so proud of what you've become," Elizabeth told him one afternoon, watching through her office window as David taught Noah how to change a tire in the parking lot below. "But I think she always knew this version of you was in there somewhere." The wooden box on David's dresser held treasures now instead of just memories. Anna's letters, Noah's first drawings, the original note from the bus, and a new addition. A photo from the Haven Project's annual fundraiser showing David surrounded by his students, all of them grinning like they'd discovered something precious. Lucas had taken the picture, capturing a moment when David wasn't aware he was being watched, when his face showed nothing but genuine joy in teaching someone else to fix what was broken. Saturday mornings had become sacred time. David would make pancakes while Noah helped by standing on a chair and stirring the batter with intense concentration. They'd eat breakfast in the sunshine streaming through their kitchen window, and David would tell stories about Anna. Not the sad stories about hospitals and goodbyes, but the beautiful ones about how she could make anyone laugh, how she sang off-key in the shower, how she'd believed in people even when they'd stopped believing in themselves. Noah absorbed these stories like a sponge, building a relationship with the mother he'd lost, but would never stop knowing. The man who looked back at David from his bathroom mirror bore little resemblance to the broken soul who'd sobbed on that bus 6 months ago. The hollow cheeks had filled out, the shoulders had straightened, and the eyes, Anna's favorite shade of warm chocolate, had remembered how to see hope in tomorrow instead of just pain from yesterday. David kept Anna's picture on his nightstand, but now it made him smile instead of cry. He'd whisper to her sometimes before falling asleep, sharing Noah's latest accomplishments and his own small victories, feeling certain somehow that she could hear him, that she'd never really been as far away as he'd feared. When a man learns to build bridges instead of walls, does he discover that the strength he was searching for had been inside him all along? 1 year after that life-changing bus ride, David found himself standing before a crowd of 200 people at the Haven Project's annual gala, his hands steady as he held the microphone that once would have terrified him into silence. Noah sat in the front row next to Lucas and Elizabeth, his 4-year-old face beaming with the kind of pride that made David's chest feel like it might burst. "Last year I was a broken man who thought failure was the only thing I was good at," David began, his voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who'd walked through fire and emerged whole. "Tonight, I want to tell you about the stranger who saved my life with 3 simple words." He told them about the bus, about the desperation, about the note that felt like a message from heaven delivered by an angel in a business suit. The audience was silent, hanging on every word as David painted the picture of rock bottom and the slow climb back to daylight. But then he smiled, that genuine expression that had taken him so long to rediscover. What I didn't know then was that Elizabeth Moore wasn't a stranger at all. She was keeping a promise to my wife, Anna, who believed in me even when I'd forgotten how to believe in myself. The applause was thunderous, but David raised his hand for quiet because he wasn't finished. "Tonight, we're launching something new. The Ana Martinez Memorial Workshop, where we'll teach job skills and provide childcare for single parents who feel like they're drowning." His voice caught slightly on Anna's name, but it was the good kind of emotion, the kind that honors love instead of mourning loss. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can tell someone isn't that they've succeeded, but that they haven't failed, that they're still in the game, still worth betting on. After the speeches and the dinner and the donations that would fund a dozen new programs, David found himself in the community center's workshop, showing a group of teenagers how to rebuild a carburetor. Among them was Marcus Thompson, a 17-year-old whose story reminded David painfully of his own. Father gone, mother working 3 jobs, dreams that felt impossibly far away. Marcus had been coming to the workshop for 3 months, his natural mechanical aptitude obvious to anyone who watched him work. As the evening wound down and the other students headed home, Marcus lingered behind, his hands nervously working a shop rag like a prayer bead. "Mr. Martinez," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I got kicked out of my mum's boyfriend's place last week. I've been sleeping in my car, but it broke down yesterday, and I don't know." The words trailed off, but David heard everything the kid wasn't saying. He'd been that kid once, carrying burdens too heavy for shoulders that young. David reached into his wallet and pulled out a small piece of paper. Not money, but something infinitely more valuable. It was a note he'd written that morning, inspired by a conversation with Noah about helping people the way Mommy Anna used to do. The handwriting was David's, but the words were pure Anna. "You haven't failed." He pressed the note into Marcus's hand, along with the keys to a spare room above the workshop that David had been quietly preparing for exactly this moment. "You're not alone, son," David said, his hand resting gently on Marcus's shoulder. "And you haven't failed." 6 months later, David stood in the same spot, watching Marcus teach a new group of students how to change brake pads, the young man's confidence transformed by the simple act of being believed in. Noah ran between the workbenches, 4 years old and already showing signs of his father's mechanical intuition, handing tools to students with the serious expression of someone doing important work. Elizabeth appeared beside David, following his gaze to the scene unfolding before them. "Anna would say, 'This is how it's supposed to work,'" she said softly. "One person helping another. Who helps another? Who helps another? Like ripples in a pond." David nodded, watching Marcus slip a folded note to a new student who looked lost and hopeless. 3 words, written in a teenager's careful script: "You haven't failed." The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning. Have you ever helped someone like this? Or been helped when you needed it most? Comment below. I want to hear your story. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Sometimes the difference between giving up and starting over is just one person who believes in you when you've forgotten how to believe in yourself. David learned he hadn't failed. He was simply waiting for the right moment to discover who he was truly meant to become. See you in the next video.